We're continuing on with our sermon series through the Sermon on the Mount, Lessons from the King, as we talk about what it means to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven. I want you to imagine you're in your early 20s, just going through the motions of life, when out of nowhere, everything changes. That's what happened to James. James was just living his life. He had a little bit of faith background, a church background. But one night, he runs into a friend of his, kind of an acquaintance, and the acquaintance says, "Hey, why don't you come with me to church?" And so James, okay, I'll come with you. And that experience at church that night changed everything for him. For the first time, this stuff about Jesus, this stuff about the Bible seemed to be real. He talked about that he had a feeling where he was cleansed, awakened, and experienced being alive like he had never been before. And James embraced this new faith with enthusiasm. He prayed and he worshiped. He read his Bible, and he started to change the way he lived. He let go of some of his old destructive habits, and he started living by faith. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that God loved him, that Jesus died for him, and that one day he would spend eternity in heaven. But after a few years, as he attended that same church where he had that experience, and he learned more about God, he learned more about Jesus and what it looks like to follow him, he found himself facing a question that many believers wrestle with. What am I here for now? He knew salvation wasn't just about waiting around for him to die and go to heaven. And he observed other people that he attended church with and how they followed some strict guidelines and rules that governed their lives, but that didn't seem to match much with the grace that he had received and how he is relying on Jesus. And so he asked around, what is the purpose of my life? What am I to do? And he got these unsatisfactory answers. Some people are called to full-time paid ministry. Some are called to be missionaries and all this. And it just didn't resonate with him. He was very passionate about computer science, and he was wrapping up his degree, his doctorate in computer science. That's where he felt like he belonged. He didn't feel called into ministry. What was he to do? Was he just there to do a little bit of evangelism as he lived his life, waiting around for him to go to heaven one day? And this is where many Christians find themselves, saved but unsure what comes after belief. And here's the answer. God didn't just save us from something, he saved us for something. Our purpose is not just to get to heaven, but to be transformed into the people he created us to be. Romans 8:29 tells us that God is transforming us or conforming us into the image of his son Jesus. In other words, the Christian life is about character. It's about becoming more like Jesus. And everything we do, whether it's doing ministry, whether it's at the workplace, or any of our other daily interactions. So the question isn't, what am I saved from? But what am I being shaped into? Because the purpose of life isn't just salvation, it's transformation. It's being made into the people that God created us to be. And so when it comes to this idea about the kingdom of heaven and that we are citizens in this kingdom, we can make being citizens of the kingdom of heaven all about following certain laws, certain regulations. That our righteousness is defined not only by the spiritual things that we do, but also by the worldly things that we avoid. But our actions are only part of the story. It also matters what is going on in our hearts, what we think about, what we feel, our emotions. It matters what we would do if all the constraints of law and rules were not on us. How would we live if we weren't constrained by these laws and these rules? See, citizens of the kingdom are to act as representatives of the kingdom. To be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven is to represent the kingdom in this world. To represent God, to represent King Jesus. Our lives are to reflect the life of Jesus. This means we are to be faithful to him, committed to be loyal to him above everything else. And so this is what we want to remember through this whole series. We can't be citizens of God's kingdom if we're not faithful to the King. We can't be citizens of God's kingdom if we're not faithful to the King. Right? If we aren't loyal citizens to the United States of America, then we're traitors. And in that same idea, if we're not loyal to King Jesus, then we're betraying the kingdom of heaven. We are to represent King Jesus in everything that we say and do. And this is the main lesson we are learning through the Sermon on the Mount. So let's just quickly look back onto where we've been before we start to move forward. First, to be citizens of the kingdom means that we have to change our values. So Jesus starts his lessons with what we call the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. See, we need to change the things that we value to align with the values of God, to align with the values that God wants his people to have. And one of the reasons this is important is because we have a calling, we have a responsibility. So Jesus says that you are the salt of the earth. That we have the responsibility of influencing God's people. He also says that you are the light of the world. That we have the responsibility of influencing the world around us for the kingdom. So we have to change our values. You have to remember that we have a calling, but we also need to remember that we are loyal, that we are following the one who has come and fulfilled the law. Jesus says, remember, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And in order to be citizens of the kingdom, you need to have a righteous life, or to live rightly with God and with others that far exceeds that of the Pharisees. And remember, the Pharisees were meticulous in how they kept the law and how they did that. But here's the issue, is that the Pharisees were so caught up with trying to be right and to do right that they missed out on the most important thing: having a right relationship with God, which starts with the motivations of our heart. And so to help us understand how we can have a righteousness that far exceeds that of the Pharisees, Jesus goes on to give us 6 case studies on what it looks like to rightly live out the law. And last week, right, we looked at that first one, the relationship between murder and anger. That it's not enough not to go through our life and not kill anyone, especially when we have anger and contempt in our hearts. Now, Jesus moves from do not commit murder to the next commandment, which is do not commit adultery. So Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 27. So Matthew 5, 27 and 28. You have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So here, just like with the with the commandment not to murder, Jesus does not deny the law, but rather he affirms it. But he also points to the reality that is deeper than the law, behind the law. See, it's crucial for us to understand this. The law may modify our behavior, but it can't transform us into the people fit for the kingdom of heaven. The law may modify our behavior. It might kind of constrict us because we don't want to experience the punishment. We don't want to get caught. So it modifies our behavior, but it doesn't transform our character. Because if the law wasn't there, if the consequence wasn't there, we would find ourselves doing what the law prohibited. And so the sin here that Jesus talks about, lust, is not just attraction. It's not just, oh, she's beautiful. No, what this sin is noticing and then dwelling on it, expanding on it, letting your mind wander. It's thinking she's beautiful and then dwelling and expanding on that thought. Or, oh, he's such a sweetheart, right? And then letting your mind take that thought to places that it shouldn't go. So it's using our minds, using our hearts to dwell on things, to dwell on the attraction, to dwell on the pleasure, to dwell on something that just meant for marriage. And so we might think, this isn't a big deal, right? This isn't hurting anyone. But we need to remember that in God's eyes, our thoughts are actions. Our thoughts are actions. They're not private. They might be private to us, but remember, God knows what? Everything. He knows the condition of our hearts. He knows our thoughts. So in God's eyes, these thoughts are actions. And these lustful thoughts do at least 3 things. First, lustful thoughts defile the marriage bed. Lustful thoughts defile the marriage bed, even if the person is not married, because sex is reserved for what? For marriage. Lustful thoughts take an act that is reserved for marriage and places it in an improper place. Second, lustful thoughts reduce the other person to an object to be used for your pleasure. And it's not okay, it's never okay to use someone who is created in the image of God just simply to use them, to get pleasure from them, and discard them. Even if that's simply only in our minds. And Jesus also here, what he also does in this teaching is he puts the responsibility on lusting, solely on the person doing the lusting. Jesus doesn't say, hey, women, you need to do better with your dress. Dress a little bit more modestly. That's not what Jesus says. Now, there may be truth to that, but that's not what Jesus does. He doesn't put the blame on the person being lusted for. He puts the blame on the one who is doing the lusting. And so what Jesus does not allow for here is, oh, boys will be boys, and kind of shrug it off, kind of laugh about it. Well, that's just how men are wired, right? That's just what they're going to do. No, Jesus wants us to understand, like, that's not okay. Just following along with your human nature or whatever is not acceptable if you're going to be in the kingdom of God. You need to do better. So lustful thoughts defile the marriage bed. They reduce the other person into an object. And third, lustful thoughts misuse God's gift of imagination and reflection. Remember, the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 says that we are to think about what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. We imagine things, when we imagine things that are inappropriate and sinful, then we're misusing God's gift of our mind, of our imaginations, of our ability to reflect. We're not using it for the purposes that God intended for it. So we need to understand that it is okay to look but not touch. It's not a loophole to get out of adultery. Like, oh, if I just look and I fantasize and I think about that, then I'm not committing adultery and I get this get out of jail free card or whatever. No, Jesus is saying that is not the case. That adultery starts in our minds and in our hearts. And when we dwell on these thoughts and they take us to places they shouldn't, that this is serious business. Jesus wants us to take this seriously. Lust is adultery in our hearts. And we need to take it seriously and realize that it has real implication in our lives. Yes, it's a hidden sin. It's a sin of our heart, of our mind. But that doesn't mean that it's without consequence. So what do? Well, Jesus goes on to say that we need to be radical in dealing with this sin. Matthew chapter 5, verses 29 and 30. So, if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. So here Jesus uses very graphic language, right? Amputation, gouging out your eye. He is emphasizing the seriousness of what he is talking about. So last week, if you remember last week, when we're angry and we hurt somebody and we treat them with contempt and we break our relationships, Jesus taught that we need to go seek reconciliation, right? And that reconciliation isn't on the person who has been hurt. It's the responsibility of the one who broke the relationship. It's the responsibility of the one who has hurt the other person. They are the ones who are to go and to reconcile. Not the other person, not the one who's been abused, not the one who's been hurt. So what are we to do with this secret sin that nobody else can see, where there's not the evidence of a broken relationship? It's all happened here. What are we to do? Well, Jesus uses this rhetorical style that was common in Jewish teaching to underscore the seriousness of sin. And so he compares what we need to do with the cutting off of our hands and gouging out of our eyes. And this lines up with some Jewish teaching that on the day of resurrection, that when you were resurrected and you were missing limbs or missing an eye, that's how you would be resurrected before you received your new body. And what Jesus is saying, and the image that he wants his followers or his hearers to imagine, is that it is better to die and to be resurrected with the evidence of your battle with sin, even if it's cost you your arm, than to go into hell intact because you haven't taken your sin seriously enough. It's better to die with the battle wounds of fighting against sin and being raised with that for all to see than go to hell with a full body. This is serious stuff. Jesus wants us to know this is serious. So we need to take time and think about, what do we lost? How do we lost? Why do we lost? We can't just ignore the problem. And we can't just say, oh, this is the responsibility of the other person. If she wasn't dressed that way, then I wouldn't have lust, right? No, it is on us, and we're the ones that need to do the surgery. So while it's helpful to cut this out sources of lust, so in our day and age, right, to maybe get rid of some devices or to put filters onto your phone and your computer, like that might be a temporary solution for a time. It might help, but the reality is, right, that we live in a world full of temptation. And a blind man with no hands can still lust. No, we need to do heart surgery. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to crucify our flesh. So we need to pray. And I found a prayer from John Eldredge about sexual healing, finding sexual healing. And so I thought about printing it out, but I thought, oh, people aren't going to pick this up. So it's easy to find. Go to whileatheart.org. I think it's .org. And they have a list of prayers. They have a prayer section. Go and find the one for sexual healing and walk through it. So John, he has some teaching. He helps explain it. And as he says in it, like, this is going to take a few times. When we have sexual brokenness, it's not just a one-and-done deal. And that's part of the reason why we need to consider this serious, because it takes time to do. So use prayer, to help crucify your flesh. But also we need to start filling our minds, right, with things that are good and honorable. So listen to worship music, meditate on scripture, and do all sorts of things like that to train your mind. And the third thing I think we need to do is, when we're faced with those lustful thoughts, we need to say no. So, no, that's not who I am. That's not who God created me to be. And whether we say that out loud or just in our mind, we need to say it. We need to vocalize, this is who I am. We're not going to go down that road anymore. So So Jesus talks about adultery and lust, and now he moves into the third case study, that of divorce. This is what he says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. You have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. So the first two case studies Jesus gave us took prohibitions, right? Do not murder, do not commit adultery. And he taught that the real problem resides in the heart. And now in these next two, he is taking things that the law allowed, divorce and making an oath. And he taught the proper reasons why God allowed for these, the proper way to look at these things. And with this one, with divorce, he wants to emphasize, or the thing that he emphasizes is this truth: marriage is sacred. Marriage is sacred. See, Jewish law provided for divorce. Jesus will say in Matthew chapter 19 that the reason God allowed for it was because of the hardness of people's hearts. Right? When you are in a covenant relationship and one person is not living up to their faithful covenant love, there has to be a way to get out of that reality. And so because of the hardness of people's heart, God allowed it. But because it was allowed, then there was this debate within Jewish culture of, well, what are the right reasons for allowing divorce? So you had one school of thought that was very lenient. Like, oh, if she displeases you in any way, you can provide her with this written notice of divorce and divorce her. Well, you had this spectrum, so you went from very lenient to very strict. You had other Jewish teachers who were even more strict than what Jesus is here, who said, well, the only permissible reason for divorce is an incestuous relationship before marriage. That's the only permissible reason for divorce. And so you had this debate going on. And what we want to do is come in and okay, Jesus, tell us what is the right reason to get divorced. And what Jesus is really saying, because the debate misses the point, what Jesus really is getting at is that marriage is sacred and should not be broken. And the reason for that is because marriage represents God's covenant love for his people. His faithful covenant love. And he doesn't give up on loving us. And so we need to take it seriously. We need to honor it. And so as we think about this and we use what Jesus teaches here to give us wisdom and how we are to proceed with marriage and divorce, in our day and age, we need to remember one very important thing is that in Jewish culture, only men were permitted to initiate divorce. And that's the reason why Jesus says here, the only permissible reason why a man should divorce his wife is because of sexual immorality. But that does not mean that applies just, we just this is the standard, because some people will do that. Unless sexual immorality has taken place, then you can't get divorced, even if abuse has taken place in the marriage. That's not what Jesus is saying. We need to remember that this is in this cultural context. Jesus is talking to men who were trying to find any justifiable reason to divorce, and he is saying, no, there's only one, and this is it. But there are other ways to break that covenant faithfulness that I think would be permissible for divorce to happen. But again, it goes back to marriage is sacred, and we need to honor it. We need to honor it. So, marriage is still intended to represent God's covenant faithfulness to his people. It's to represent God's covenant faithfulness to our children, to the world around us, and even to ourselves when we're in marriage. Like, there is a covenant here. There's a faithfulness here. And that helps us understand God's covenant love for us. And so marriage needs to be held in high honor. We need to do what we can to support it, nurture it, and protect it. So if you're married, make time to value your marriage. Remember your vows. Love each other. And if you're divorced, be gracious with yourself. You can't undo the past. Now is the time to extend forgiveness and to move on. You're not in perpetual adultery. God has forgiven you, and so now is the time to cherish marriage and move forward. As Jesus is talking about the sacredness of marriage and honoring the covenant of marriage, he moves on to oaths. And this is what he says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. You have also heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows. You must carry out the vows you make to the Lord. But I say, do not make any vows. Do not say by heaven, because heaven is God's throne. And do not say by the earth, because the earth is his footstool. And do not say by Jerusalem, for Jerusalem is the city of the great king. Do not even say by my head, for you can't turn one hair white or black. Just simply say, yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. We are God's people. We already bear his name. Therefore, our word should be enough. See, in Jesus' day, people often swore oaths. Some people would swear an oath by God, calling God to be a witness to what they are saying, the promise they're making, or the statement they're saying. Like, this is the truth because God is my witness. Now, remember, a lot of Jews in Jesus' day wanted to honor God's name, and so they wouldn't say that. So they wouldn't swear by God. Rather, they would swear by things associated with God, by heaven, or by Jerusalem. And this was all intended to add weight to what they were saying. Like, you can believe me. But Jesus teaches that all such things, heaven, earth, Jerusalem, even our heads, all belong to him. And therefore, our integrity should be enough. Our word should be enough. We're already God's people. We already bear his name. We don't need to call on God. We don't need to say, God is my witness. Why? Because God is already with us. We are his representatives, and we need to be able to keep our word. So it's important here to note, too, that this is not a prohibition against making an oath, like in court, to swear, I tell the truth, or if you're a public servant and you swear to uphold your public duties. Jesus is not saying you can't do those things. Those are cultural expectations. But what he is really getting at is that we shouldn't try to manipulate people into believing us by using God's name, by using things associated with God. No, we simply, because we are created in God's image, we are part of his kingdom, we bear his name, our integrity should be enough. Our yes should be enough. Our no should be enough. People should be able to believe us. So let your yes be yes and your no, no. Reflect God's truthfulness by keeping your word. It's not enough to follow the external commands of the law. Our inner life matters, and it must mirror God's holy character. This is the only way to have a righteousness that is greater than the Pharisees. They were meticulous in following the law and sometimes provided loopholes around it, but Jesus wants citizens who will represent the kingdom well, to influence the world for good, because that is who they are inside and out. So whether it's thoughts, temptations, or broken relationships, we must always take radical steps to align our lives with God's standards. It's seeking reconciliation when we've hurt people. It's doing the heart surgery needed through prayer and meditation to think properly and to have right types of thoughts in our lives. It's honoring our marriage vows even when we want to call it quits. It's choosing to be a person of integrity when in the past it would be easier to deceive others. Our commitments in marriage and our everyday promises reflect the integrity God desires. Remember, we're called to influence the world and represent King Jesus in all that we say and do. And this requires integrity on our part. So here's our big idea this morning. Citizens of the kingdom align their hearts, not just their actions, with the character of King Jesus. Citizens of the kingdom align their hearts, not just their actions, with the character of King Jesus. And so our challenge this week is this. Take time this week to reflect on the condition of your heart. Ask God to reveal the sickness, the brokenness, the hurt that resides there. And pray and ask God for healing and transformation. And also in that, commit to following Jesus. God is after our heart, and we need to surrender it to him. And in this, I want you to remember what Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. I am certain that the God who began the good work within you will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. Who is doing the heart surgery in us? God is. And Paul's promise here is that God is not going to give up on us. He's not going to abandon us. He is going to continue that work. So don't give up on God. Our part in all of this is to surrender, to pray, to meditate, to continue to do good works, and to seek forgiveness. When we live that type of life, God is going to heal us. He's going to bring us, transform our hearts. God will not abandon you. He will bring you to transformation and to completion. God is not going to abandon us. He is going to see our transformation to its completion.